In the dark heart of Charleston, 1851, a secret festered behind the polished doors of the city's grandest mansions. Few dared whisper it, fewer still understood it. A man who had been trained to heal, to preserve life, had instead learned to wield death with the precision of a surgeon. Solomon Fairfax, a slave whose family had been torn apart by the merciless machinery of human trafficking, carried a knowledge most were never meant to possess. In his hands, the same compounds used to ease suffering became instruments of calculated vengeance. Imagine a world where every neighbor, every prominent merchant, every man whose hands profited from broken families could suddenly be rendered powerless, conscious yet unable to move, trapped in the terror of their own bodies. The city hummed with the superficial life of wealth and power, oblivious to the storm that broods silently in its shadows. Solomon watched and listened for years, absorbing routines, schedules, weaknesses, and desires. Each conversation in the candlelit parlors of Charleston's elite, every detail revealed by unwitting confidants, became another brushstroke in a portrait of retribution he was painting with meticulous care. His family's screams, sold and scattered like commodities, haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. Every tear shed by his wife, every cry of his children ripped from his arms, became the moral calculus by which he measured the lives of those who had orchestrated his suffering. And yet, Solomon moved among them unnoticed, a ghost in the kitchens, a silent shadow in the corridors of power. He gained trust, learned the hidden patterns of privilege, and turned the very mechanisms that enslaved him into tools of his vengeance. This is where our descent begins, into a world where morality bends under the weight of unacknowledged atrocity, where the boundaries between justice and murder blur, and where a single mind, driven by righteous fury, can unravel the very fabric of an entire society. Tonight, you will witness the untold story of Solomon's revenge, a tale buried in the archives of Charleston, suppressed by time and concealed behind polite society. The horrors you are about to hear are real, the methods calculated, and the consequences eternal. This is not merely a story of murder. It is a revelation of the darkness that festers when injustice goes unchecked. Hold your gaze steady, because what you are about to discover was never meant to see the light of day. The city of Charleston thrived on appearances, a glittering facade masking a brutal undercurrent of human exploitation. The merchants, captains, and magistrates who walked its streets daily carried themselves with confidence, secure in the illusion of control. They were unaware that within their very homes and offices, a silent observer catalogued every habit, every ritual, every detail that would become a thread in Solomon Fairfax's tapestry of vengeance. His knowledge of medicine, once a gift meant to heal, now offered him insight into the vulnerabilities of the human body, the thresholds of consciousness, the fine line between life and death. Solomon's method was not one of chaos, but precision. Every action calculated, every moment timed, every poison measured. He studied the comings and goings of Charleston's elite, noted the servants who whispered their secrets without suspicion, and listened to conversations about shipping profits, property disputes, and the commodification of human lives. With every detail, he prepared for a reckoning that would transform the city's understanding of fear. But Solomon's rage was not blind. Each victim was chosen with purpose, each strike a response to a crime that the law could not or would not punish. The very society that declared itself civilized had destroyed his family without consequence. The knowledge of this injustice burned in him, a relentless fire that guided his hand, sharpened his focus, and steeled his resolve. while Charleston's merchants dined under chandeliers and discussed the next profitable voyage, Solomon's mind calculated the paths of their demise. He moved unseen among the kitchens, the service corridors, the shadowed halls where whispers could never reach the ears of the powerful. His presence was a ghostly inevitability, a shadow that promised both silence and reckoning. Every detail of Charleston's elite lifestyle, their schedules, their indulgences, their weaknesses was absorbed like a scholar taking notes for a thesis that could not be printed, a manuscript written in the language of death. And yet, as meticulous as Solomon's planning became, a subtle tension coiled beneath the surface. A journalist named Thomas Grimby had begun to connect the dots, tracing the recent string of mysterious deaths among Charleston's prominent figures. Each visit Grimby made to St. Michael's Cemetery, each inquiry into burial records, threatened to pierce the veil Solomon had so carefully constructed. The hunter was becoming aware of the predator, and the city that had believed itself untouchable was about to discover that one man, armed with knowledge, patience, and unimaginable fury, could bring its entire hierarchy to its knees. May 20th, 1853 arrived like a sinister tide, drawing Charleston's elite into the ornate dining room of Captain Dandridge's mansion, a fortress of wealth built on human suffering. Crystal chandeliers reflected the glow of candlelight, casting fractured shadows on the polished floors where polished shoes and silken skirts danced in oblivion to the horrors that had birthed their prosperity. Solomon Fairfax moved among them, invisible yet omniscient, a spectre cloaked in the guise of servitude. Martha, the elderly slave who oversaw the kitchen, welcomed his assistance with gratitude, unaware that his presence was not a simple favor, but a carefully orchestrated infiltration. He refilled wine glasses, cleared plates, and listened, his ears attuned to the casual cruelties of men who discussed human cargo with the same ease as cotton bales. Captain Dandridge, a figure of maritime authority with hands weathered by decades at sea, spoke freely of controlling the bodies and minds of enslaved people during long voyages, offering strategies for profit that made Solomon's blood run cold. Every detail of their conversation, every boast about preventing rebellion or maximizing survival of human cargo, etched itself into Solomon's memory. He had rehearsed this moment for months, calculated every movement, every possibility, every contingency. The desert course arrived, brandy-soaked cake, a concoction prepared individually for each guest, and Solomon executed his plan with clinical precision, infusing the captain's portion with his paralytic compound. The poison was tasteless, swift, invisible, a weapon honed through relentless study. Dandridge ate with pleasure, complimenting Martha, oblivious to the fate that would descend upon him. Within minutes, dizziness claimed him. By the time he excused himself for fresh air, the toxin had taken hold, transforming his body into a prison of immobility while consciousness remained intact. He collapsed in his study, a silent scream trapped behind eyes that could no longer act. The dinner guests were unaware that the evening had shifted from social gathering to the theatre of vengeance. When Dandridge was discovered 20 minutes later, the room erupted in alarm. Physicians summoned, questions demanded, theories proposed, poison whispered through the air as an unspoken truth, a revelation that threatened to expose Solomon's methodical hand. Meanwhile, Thomas Grimby's investigation tightened, his footsteps tracing a path that would soon intersect with Solomon's shadow. The journalist's obsession with Charleston's elite deaths had brought him closer than anyone could imagine to the mind orchestrating them. Every passing hour increased the tension, the inevitability of confrontation. and the impending unraveling of the most calculated campaign of revenge the city had ever witnessed. The balance between justice and terror hung by a thread, and Solomon, hidden in plain sight, was the one who controlled it. By the time the sun rose over Charleston on May 21st, 1853, the city's gossip mill had already begun churning. Captain Dandridge's death was no longer a private misfortune but a public spectacle, whispered about in markets, taverns, and drawing rooms alike. Solomon Fairfax, ever calm, watched from the shadows as news spread, knowing that attention was now unavoidable. Thomas Grimby, the relentless journalist, had arrived before dawn, questioning servants, documenting conversations, piecing together fragments that would soon reveal a terrifying pattern. Solomon's advantaged invisibility of his methods was slipping. The delicate balance he had maintained between vengeance and exposure teetered dangerously. For months, he had meticulously selected his targets, men whose wealth and cruelty had destroyed his family. Each had a role in a network that thrived on human suffering. Yet each also held a position that made them untouchable within Charleston's social hierarchy. The dinner had removed one, but 6 more awaited, their proximity to one another providing an opportunity too tempting to ignore, even as risk escalated. Solomon retreated to the solitude of his modest quarters, reviewing his plans with obsessive precision. He studied the movements of his next targets, the timing of business meetings, the hours when buildings emptied into the night. He refined the paralytic compound, now in its most concentrated form, and traced the vulnerabilities of the Henderson and Associates building, a site where 6 prominent slave traders would soon convene. That meeting would be his most audacious strike yet. He knew that capturing them simultaneously would not only satisfy a desire for revenge, but send a message about the cost of cruelty. Each decision was a descent into moral darkness, a calculated leap into the abyss. Yet Solomon justified it with a clarity born of grief. He was not a murderer in the conventional sense. He was an instrument of retributive justice, shaped by a society that had denied him every legal recourse. Meanwhile, the city's social fabric grew tense. Rumors of systematic poisoning stirred unease among the elite, paranoia seeping into their dealings. Families whispered warnings, slaves noticed the heightened vigilance of their masters, and Grimby's inquiries hinted at a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Solomon's mind, disciplined and resolute, considered every variable: timing, method, exposure, escape. He knew that the upcoming night could either complete his mission or end it in blood and capture. As dusk fell on June 15, 1853, he approached Henderson and Associates with a calm that masked the storm of calculated vengeance within. The building, bathed in the last light of day, was the stage for the most terrifying demonstration of human ingenuity and rage the city had yet witnessed. A culmination of years of suffering, planning, and relentless desire for justice. The evening air hung heavy over Charleston on June 15, 1853. A silence thick with anticipation and dread. Henderson and Associates, a stately brick building housing the city's most ruthless slave traders, stood like a tomb awaiting its occupants. Solomon Fairfax, moving through the shadows of the adjacent alley, observed the last arrivals, men whose wealth was matched only by their cruelty. Each carried the arrogance of power, convinced in their untouchable status, blind to the invisible hand about to strike. Months of preparation coalesced in this moment. The paralytic compound, refined into a concentrated, airborne form, waited silently within the building's gas line system. Solomon had spent nights ensuring every lamp, every vent, every corner of the office would carry the toxin evenly, a perfect blend of science and vengeance. As darkness fell, lamps flickered to life, and the office filled with a faint, innocuous odor, imperceptible to the men inside. Solomon's heart beat with controlled intensity as he monitored the building from his hidden vantage, understanding that within minutes, the 6 men would fall into the trap he had designed. Inside, the traders conversed, oblivious to the encroaching danger. Their discussions of profits, human cargo, and shipping routes resonated with casual brutality, a symphony of exploitation that only fueled Solomon's resolve. 30 minutes passed. Then, the first signs of paralysis rippled through the office. Fingers froze over ledgers, heads slumped forward, eyes widening in horror as comprehension dawned too late. The 6 men, trapped in the horrifying limbo between life and death, could see and hear everything but could not move a muscle. Their terror was immediate, visceral, the culmination of Solomon's carefully honed knowledge of anatomy and pharmacology. With a duplicate key obtained through meticulous planning, Solomon entered the building through the rear. The sight that greeted him was both horrific and exquisite in its symmetry. Men who had caused immeasurable suffering were now immobile, fully conscious, witnessing their own helplessness. Solomon approached each, speaking in calm, clinical tones, detailing precisely what they were experiencing, describing the paralytic effects, the inevitability of their helplessness, the long hours that would follow before discovery. Panic flickered across their eyes, disbelief contorted their features, and a terrifying clarity settled over the room. This was justice, executed by hands they had long considered powerless. And yet, in the shadows of the corridor, an unexpected presence disrupted the tableau. Thomas Grimby, the journalist whose persistence had shadowed Solomon's campaign from the start, now emerged, eyes wide with revelation and horror. In that instant, the carefully orchestrated plan intersected with the relentless pursuit of truth, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test morality, justice, and the very limits of human endurance. The air in Henderson and Associates building became electric with tension as Solomon, Fairfax, and Thomas Grimby faced each other. 2 men on opposite sides of a moral and historical chasm. Grimby's gaze held the weight of revelation, a mixture of horror, fascination, and a grudging understanding of the force that had created this methodical killer. Solomon, calm and composed, met the journalist's eyes without flinching. "You see what justice looks like when the system fails," he said quietly, his voice low but unwavering. Grimby, the chronicler of truth, struggled to reconcile his professional duty with the undeniable moral outrage that had driven Solomon to these extremes. The 6 immobilized men, their eyes wide with conscious terror, bore witness to a confrontation that transcended conventional law. Every second stretched into an eternity. The stillness of the paralyzed traders accentuated the gravity of what had unfolded. Solomon walked slowly among them, examining faces frozen in the final moments of agency, savoring the awareness that these men, who had profited from the destruction of countless families, now understood helplessness in its most intimate and intimate form. Grimby's voice broke the silence. "They are still alive, aren't they?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Solomon nodded, explaining the paralytic's effects in meticulous detail. The scientific precision of his cruelty intertwined with the raw moral impetus that had driven him. "They will know, just as my family knew," he said, a shadow of sorrow beneath the coldness. The conversation deepened, revealing the complex psychological layers of both men. Grimby, educated in the ethics of journalism yet steeped in the complicity of Southern society, recognized the truth behind Solomon's vengeance. Every word, every method, every carefully executed step of the plan demonstrated a mind trained in both medicine and retribution. Outside, footsteps grew louder, the distant clatter of approaching constables and city watchmen echoing down the narrow streets. Time was collapsing around them. Solomon's choices had led him here, an apex of preparation, execution, and confrontation with an unflinching observer. Grimby, understanding the inevitable, whispered a fleeting offer of escape, a momentary divergence from history. "You could still leave," he said, urgency in his tone. Solomon's eyes held quiet resolution. Escape was never the goal. Justice's form of justice was meant to be seen, to be recorded, and to leave a mark on those who had lived untouched for too long. In that frozen room, where terror, intellect, and moral ambiguity collided, the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred. Grimby recorded every detail, knowing that the story unfolding before him would reverberate far beyond Charleston, challenging perceptions of justice, morality, and the dangerous consequences of a society built on the systematic destruction of families. The stage was set, the actors frozen, and the forbidden truths of human vengeance were about to be inscribed into history. The sound of boots pounding on the wooden floors outside the conference room announced the inevitable. Charleston's city constables had arrived, summoned by rumors, suspicion, and the scent of impending revelation. Solomon Fairfax remained still, a figure of unnerving composure as Grimby silently observed, documenting every movement, every calculated breath. The 6 paralyzed men around the table were living witnesses to both crime and retribution, their eyes darting frantically as reality and helplessness intertwined. The door burst open, and officers spilled into the room, their eyes widening at the scene before them. Men apparently dead, seated as if time itself had frozen them mid-conversation. Solomon raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement, his presence calm, deliberate, almost ceremonial. No panic, no flight, only the undeniable certainty of a man who had spent years planning, calculating, and executing a mission born from injustice. The chief constable, a man hardened by years of policing Charleston's streets, stepped forward, suspicion etched on every line of his face. "Step away," he commanded, but Solomon did not move. He spoke instead, his voice steady, precise, and eerily detached. He recounted, without hesitation, every detail of the paralytic compound. The preparation, the targeted selection of victims, and the scientific methods that had allowed him to manipulate life and death with surgical precision. The constables exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the confession pressing against their disbelief. Grimby recorded it all, his journal capturing the methodical, terrifying logic that had governed Solomon's actions. Outside, the city was stirring. Charleston would soon awaken to a scandal that would haunt its social and economic elite for decades. Each constable understood, instinctively, that this was not a simple case of murder. The crimes revealed a truth far darker. An educated slave, armed with knowledge forbidden by the very system that oppressed him, could overturn power, instill terror, and expose the hidden vulnerabilities of the elite. Solomon's calm authority in the face of capture disarmed fear with a chilling clarity. The paralyzed men, still alive, were finally examined by medical professionals summoned on the spot. Their accounts eyes wide, voices quivering once freed from their torment, confirmed what Solomon had described, hours of conscious paralysis. an intimate horror shared with a man who had once been powerless in the face of systemic cruelty. The revelation sent shockwaves through Charleston's upper echelons. Families whispered, newspapers prepared sensational accounts, and Grimby, understanding the gravity of his access, preserved every word, every observation, knowing that this documentation would survive long after Solomon himself faced judgment. In that room, the boundaries between victim, oppressor, and avenger blurred, leaving a haunting question lingering. When justice is denied, how far will the human mind go to reclaim it? The stage of retribution was complete, the city unaware of the storm about to erupt. And Solomon Fairfax remained a calm eye in the center of chaos, poised to confront the consequences of a vengeance the history would never forget. Charleston awoke to a horror it had never imagined. News of Solomon Fairfax's capture and the paralyzed men spread through the city like wildfire, whispered in markets, discussed behind shuttered windows, and debated in the halls of power. The trial that followed was not merely a legal proceeding, it became a public spectacle, a mirror reflecting the grotesque realities of the slave system, while challenging every assumption about justice, morality, and the limits of human endurance. Solomon appeared in court with the same composed dignity he had maintained through his campaign of revenge. His presence silenced murmurs. His eyes, dark and unwavering, seemed to look through the centuries of cruelty and oppression that had shaped him. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Rutledge, presented the case as a simple matter of criminal law. A slave who had taken the lives of 9 prominent citizens and threatened the social order must face the ultimate punishment. Yet the defense, led by Benjamin Crawford, approached the impossible task of defending a man who had confessed openly, whose methodical documentation left no room for doubt. Crawford's strategy was not to deny guilt, but to expose the machinery of destruction that had created Solomon Fairfax. Witnesses described the separation of families, the cold calculation of slave markets, and the casual cruelty that permeated Charleston's maritime and merchant elite. Solomon himself testified, detailing the destruction of his family, the forced sale of his children, and the death of his wife, events that had occurred while he remained powerless, forced to obey laws designed to strip humanity from those like him. His words were not cries of anger, but measured explanations, the articulation of a philosophy forged in suffering. When justice is denied, revenge becomes the instrument of truth. Medical experts explained the paralytic compound he had developed, confirming the precision of his methods. Survivors of the Henderson and Associates meeting recounted their terror, their voices trembling as they described lying conscious, trapped within their own bodies, witnessing their own deaths as if in a waking nightmare. The courtroom, packed with Charleston's citizens, became a chamber of conflicted emotions, fascination, disgust, and a reluctant understanding. Grimby documented every word, capturing the paradox of a man both monstrous and justified, a figure who transformed knowledge once used to heal into a weapon of morally complex vengeance. By the end of the proceedings, the jury required less than an hour to deliver a verdict, guilty on all counts. Yet even as Solomon was sentenced to death by hanging, the questions remained. How could a society that called itself just allow the destruction of a family to occur legally? And when that society meted out punishment for retaliation, who was truly guilty? Solomon's calm acceptance of his fate became a final, defiant statement. Justice, denied, had been reclaimed not with law, but with the knowledge of cruelty transformed into precision and retribution. October 15th, 1853, Charleston's streets thrummed with tension. A crowd of over 2,000 gathered to witness the execution of a man whose name had become synonymous with fear, fascination, and forbidden justice. Solomon Fairfax, calm and unflinching, ascended the gallows as if walking toward the culmination of a carefully orchestrated symphony of vengeance. The city, still reeling from the revelation that 3 of his earlier victims, Colonel Fitzpatrick, Judge Calverton, and Captain Dandridge, had been buried alive, watched in silent anticipation, unsure whether they were witnessing punishment, spectacle, or the tragic conclusion of a moral paradox too complex for their comprehension. Solomon's eyes scanned the crowd, lingering briefly on the faces of those who had enforced the system that had destroyed his family. There was no hatred in his gaze, only an eerie calm, a serenity born from the certainty that his actions, methodical and precise, had fulfilled a higher form of justice. Thomas Grimby, ever the observer, recorded every moment, understanding that this execution was more than a legal formality. It was the closing chapter of a story that exposed the grotesque underpinnings of Charleston's elite society. As the noose was placed, Solomon's voice, firm and unwavering, addressed both the assembly and history itself. I die knowing that 9 men experienced the terror my children felt when they were torn from everything they loved. That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. But this system that creates such desperation will continue, and other families will suffer as mine did. When that happens, remember that even the most patient man has limits to what he will endure in silence. The words struck the crowd like a thunderclap, and for a moment, even the city's most hardened slave owners seemed to confront the human cost of their wealth and power. The trapdoor opened, and Solomon fell, his final heartbeat echoing the years of planning, suffering, and meticulous execution of his revenge. When the crowd dispersed, a palpable unease lingered. Charleston had witnessed not only a death, but the undeniable proof that those considered powerless could wield knowledge as a weapon of unprecedented reach. In the days that followed, the city grappled with the revelations of his campaign, the paralytic compound, the carefully chosen victims, and the psychological torment he had inflicted. Newspapers reprinted Grimby's accounts, sparking debates far beyond the South, questioning the stability of slavery and the intellectual capacities of the enslaved. Families across the region began demanding exhumations, fearful that their own dead might have suffered as Fairfax's victims had. The execution did not erase the memory of the terror, nor did it soothe the uneasy recognition that education and access to knowledge could transform the oppressed into agents of calculated retribution. Solomon's body was buried in an unmarked grave outside Charleston city limits, but his story, preserved in journals, testimonies, and scratch marks in coffin lids, would continue to haunt the collective conscience of a society built on human bondage. This was not merely the death of a man, it was the birth of a cautionary legend, a tale of revenge, intellect, and the inexorable consequences of systemic cruelty. Beneath the sprawling branches of a magnolia tree in St. Michael's Cemetery, hidden from prying eyes, lay a journal that would forever transform the way Charleston and, eventually, the nation understood the depths of Solomon Fairfax's mind. Thomas Grimby, burdened with the responsibility of recording every meticulous detail of Fairfax's campaign, had buried the journal with precision, understanding that its contents were too dangerous to remain in circulation, yet too important to destroy. Within its pages were the careful notes of a man trained in the art of healing, twisted by grief into a scholar of vengeance. Each entry documented the construction of the paralytic compound, the methodical selection of victims, and the precise timing necessary to enact his form of justice. But the journal revealed more than scientific ingenuity. It exposed the psychology of a man shaped by systemic cruelty, detailing the hours of planning, the surveillance of the elite, and the conversations overheard that mapped out the hierarchy of Charleston's slave trade. Grimby, while examining the journal, recorded his own reflections alongside Fairfax's notes, revealing a mind torn between moral obligation and empathetic understanding of the forces that had created a killer. The scratches Fairfax made in his early experimental victims' coffins were noted in chilling detail, providing proof of the horrifying reality. Men had been buried alive, conscious of their own impending deaths, forced to confront the consequences of a lifetime of exploiting others. This journal, Grimby concluded, was a ledger not of crimes alone, but of truths too long suppressed, the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people, the calculated cruelty of Charleston's mercantile elite, and the fragile morality of a society that labeled justice as legal conformity rather than ethical responsibility. By burying it, Grimby ensured that the knowledge would not spark immediate chaos. Yet he understood that someday the journal's revelations would resurface, challenging perceptions of power, oppression, and the human capacity for retribution. Decades later, during a renovation of the cemetery in 1923, the journal was uncovered, along with the scratch marks inside 9 coffins, confirming the accuracy of Grimby's meticulous reporting and cementing Fairfax's legacy as both healer and executioner. The discovery reignited debates about the moral limits of vengeance and the systemic failures that had driven a man to such precise and horrifying acts. What Grimby had feared that the journal could inspire others was tempered by its power to illuminate the often invisible consequences of slavery, proving that even in silence, injustice breeds formidable resistance. Now, the story of Solomon Fairfax was no longer a whispered legend. It was a documented testament to the corrosive effects of power abused, and the terrifying precision with which knowledge, once weaponized, could redefine justice itself. When news of the journal's discovery and the scratch marks within the 9 coffins reached Charleston, the city erupted in a mixture of horror, disbelief, and bitter fascination. Newspapers that had long reported on the city's social gatherings and maritime prosperity now carried headlines that revealed a darkness buried just beneath the polished surfaces of wealth and power. Families who had once prided themselves on the respectability of their ancestors began questioning whether their own forebears had escaped Fairfax's vengeance or worse, had been perpetrators of similar horrors. The public confronted a paradox. The men Solomon had targeted were criminals by any measure of ethical judgment, yet their social prominence and legal protections had shielded them until Fairfax's calculated retribution exposed the fragility of that veneer. The discovery sparked a wider discourse on the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people, as Fairfax's knowledge of chemistry, pharmacology, and human physiology forced citizens to reconsider the long-standing assumption that education and skill were the exclusive domain of the free. Educated slaves, once seen as tools of convenience or novelty, were now understood as potential architects of resistance, capable not only of survival but of meticulous and terrifying agency. In response, the state implemented stricter laws regulating the education of enslaved people, banning access to books, medical training, and scientific knowledge, fearing that Fairfax's example could inspire rebellion elsewhere. Yet, while the law sought to control minds, it could not erase the moral reckoning Fairfax had ignited. In homes across Charleston, Conversations that had once been whispered in fear were now spoken openly, debating the ethics of vengeance, the moral corruption of the slave trade, and the role of conscience in systems designed to suppress humanity. Scholars, physicians, and clergy weighed in, some condemning Fairfax as a murderer, others reluctantly acknowledging the calculated logic of his revenge. A justice denied by courts, but achieved through intellect and precision. The ripple effects extended beyond Charleston, influencing debates in newspapers and public forums across the antebellum South. For historians and criminologists, Fairfax's actions became a case study in forensic methodology, psychological motivation, and the weaponization of knowledge. For ordinary citizens, the story was a grim reminder that beneath the surface of lawful society lurked unresolved horrors, and that patience, education, and planning could overturn even the most rigid hierarchies. The city's elite, previously unshakable in their confidence, now found themselves scrutinized, fearful of educated slaves who might harbor knowledge and grievances capable of dismantling their perceived security. Solomon Fairfax had become more than a criminal. He had become a symbol, a warning etched into history, about the dangers of underestimating the minds of the oppressed, and the enduring power of justice that defies law. The trial of Solomon Fairfax was unlike anything Charleston had ever witnessed, a theater of moral and legal tension that exposed the hidden rot of a society built on human suffering. From the moment he was led into the courtroom, Fairfax exuded the same cold, deliberate calm that had guided his campaign of revenge, his eyes scanning the gallery with a measured detachment, as if assessing each spectator for complicity or weakness. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Rutland, presented a case framed in stark, uncompromising terms. A slave had murdered 9 prominent citizens and must face the full weight of the law. Yet Rutland's arguments, though forceful, could not fully mask the uncomfortable truth Fairfax's crimes revealed, that these men had profited from a system of unimaginable cruelty, one that had systematically destroyed families and treated human life as commodity. The defense, led by the reluctant attorney Benjamin Crawford, confronted a nearly impossible task, arguing not for innocence, but for the moral context that had transformed a healer into a calculated killer. Crawford meticulously presented testimony about the slave auctions, the separation of families, and the psychological terror inflicted on the enslaved, portraying Fairfax's vengeance as an inevitable eruption of a justice system that had failed utterly. Fairfax himself took the stand with a methodical precision, recounting the destruction of his family, the knowledge he had painstakingly acquired, and the careful execution of each act, leaving the courtroom both horrified and captivated. He spoke not with remorse, but with a clinical rationality that framed his murders as a form of retributive justice, a mirror reflecting the cruelty of those who had profited from human suffering. Witnesses described the paralyzed victims, their consciousness trapped in bodies that appeared dead, providing a level of psychological terror that mere homicide could not convey. Public interest surged beyond Charleston. Newspapers from Virginia to Louisiana reprinted Grimby's detailed coverage, spreading the story of Fairfax's methodical revenge and forcing a reluctant society to confront the consequences of its moral blindness. Physicians analyzed the paralytic compound, debating its effects and marveling at the sophistication required to weaponize such knowledge. Jurors, burdened by the undeniable evidence and the uncomfortable moral context, deliberated briefly. Less than an hour later, Fairfax was convicted on all counts, sentenced to hang, and the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief, fear, and lingering moral unease. Outside, the streets buzzed with debate, whispers of fear and fascination, as citizens confronted the reality that even the most carefully controlled society could be upended by a single mind armed with knowledge, patience, and a relentless will. Fairfax's trial became a public mirror, reflecting both the sins of the powerful and the terrifying potential of the oppressed who had learned the tools of power themselves. October 15, 1853 arrived with a heavy, suffocating tension that seemed to seep into every corner of Charleston. Over 2,000 souls had gathered to witness the execution of Solomon Fairfax, the man who had turned grief and rage into a weapon so precise it had left the city trembling in horror. From the moment he emerged onto the gallows platform, Fairfax held himself with a composure that defied the chaos surrounding him, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, taking in not only the curious and the outraged, but also the subtle unease etched into the faces of those who had once wielded unchecked power. The air was thick with anticipation, and the murmurs of a city divided between condemnation and a grim fascination created a resonance that seemed to echo the weight of history itself. Fairfax's final words, captured meticulously by Thomas Grimby, cut through the murmurs like a scalpel, leaving no ambiguity about his motives or his perspective on the society that had produced him. "I die knowing that 9 men experienced the terror my children felt when they were sold away from everything they loved," he said, his voice steady, controlled, almost eerily calm. "That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. But this system that creates such desperation will continue, and other families will suffer as mine did. When that happens, remember that even the most patient man has limits to what he will endure in silence." The crowd listened, some with shock, some with discomforted awe, recognizing in his words a reflection of truths they had long refused to acknowledge. As the trapdoor fell, the collective heartbeat of Charleston seemed to pause, suspended in the realization that justice, revenge, and morality had collided in a single figure. Fairfax's body was interred in an unmarked grave beyond the city limits, a legal necessity, but it did not bury the story or the chilling implications of his actions. Whispers about the paralytic compound, about the victims who had survived in a state of conscious horror, and about the broader meaning of Fairfax's meticulous vengeance circulated throughout the South. Among the enslaved population, the tale became a shadowed legend, a quiet spark of resistance and fear, suggesting that knowledge, patience, and resolve could overturn even the most entrenched hierarchies. Among the white elite, suspicion and paranoia grew, leading to laws restricting education and access to knowledge for slaves. Measures born not only of fear for their own safety, but of recognition that power was no longer the exclusive domain of the privileged. Scientific communities debated the pharmacological innovations Fairfax had exploited, leading to the early development of forensic toxicology techniques that would shape criminal investigations for decades. And Thomas Grimby, having documented every detail, knew the responsibility he carried. A story too dark for some to comprehend, too illuminating to allow to fade. His later act of burying Fairfax's journal beneath a magnolia tree at St. Michael's Cemetery ensured that future generations would confront the shadowed truths of Charleston. Long after the city had tried to wash its hands of the past, the legacy of Fairfax was neither simple nor moral in conventional terms. It was a mirror reflecting the brutality, corruption, and unacknowledged humanity that history often sought to conceal. The year was 1923, 70 years after the executions, when a routine renovation at St. Michael's Cemetery uncovered a secret long buried beneath the magnolia tree. Workers digging near the graves of Charleston's elite stumbled upon a weathered, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle but remarkably preserved. The journal belonged to Solomon Fairfax, the slave whose revenge had shattered the city's complacency, and its contents promised truths too potent for most to confront. Within those pages, Fairfax documented every calculated step of his vendetta for paralytic compounds, the carefully observed routines of his victims, the psychological torment he inflicted while they remained conscious yet immobile. But the most horrifying revelation came when the workers discovered the 9 coffins associated with Fairfax's original victims. Each lid bore faint scratch marks, as if the occupants had clawed desperately to escape their wooden prisons, a physical testament to the terror Fairfax had orchestrated. News of the discovery spread like wildfire, reigniting debates that had long been thought settled. Families whose ancestors had profited from the slave trade recoiled at the implication that their forebears had been buried alive, victims of the very vengeance they had trained Fairfax to fear and despise. Scholars and journalists rushed to study the journal, uncovering a mind disciplined by pain, grief, and meticulous intelligence. Fairfax's writings revealed not only the mechanics of murder, but the philosophy underpinning it. A system had destroyed his family, left him powerless, and denied justice. He had responded not with blind rage, but with strategic precision, weaponizing knowledge and patience against those who believed themselves untouchable. Thomas Grimby's earlier accounts, long considered sensationalized, were now confirmed in the most chilling way possible. The scratches in the coffins proved beyond doubt that the victims had been fully aware of their fates, experiencing hours of psychological agony before death claimed them. Public reaction was a mix of disbelief, revulsion, and begrudging fascination. The story forced the city and the South at large to confront the systemic cruelty of slavery in a visceral, undeniable form. Medical historians examined Fairfax's paralytic compounds, noting the sophistication required to induce temporary paralysis while preserving consciousness, a method far ahead of its time. Lawmakers debated whether new regulations were needed to prevent similar acts, while social philosophers pondered the ethical implications of revenge enacted with surgical precision. Among the descendants of slaves, Fairfax became a spectral symbol of resistance, a reminder that knowledge, patience, and calculated courage could defy even the most entrenched oppression. The uncovering of the journal and coffins did not merely illuminate a forgotten crime. It exposed the fragility of moral certainty and the lengths to which a wronged individual could bend the rules of life and death. It was as though the past had clawed its way back into the present, demanding recognition and reflection. The revelation of Solomon Fairfax's journal and the clawed coffins sent shockwaves through Charleston, reverberating far beyond the city's cobblestone streets and plantation-lined outskirts. Suddenly, the carefully constructed facade of Southern civility was stripped away, exposing the rot beneath a society built on human commodification. Medical authorities scrambled to understand the paralytic compound, consulting chemists, apothecaries, and even university scholars who marveled at Fairfax's mastery of pharmacology despite his status as a slave. The very notion that an enslaved man had attained knowledge capable of immobilizing adults without killing them outright challenged deeply ingrained prejudices about intelligence, discipline, and control. Legal scholars debated whether the system that created Fairfax's revenge bore more guilt than the man himself, questioning whether murder could ever be morally separated from the injustices that inspired it. City officials, desperate to maintain social order, quickly classified the findings, limiting public access to both the journal and forensic reports, citing fears of contagions, social, moral, and perhaps even physical, from knowledge too dangerous to circulate freely. At the same time, families of the victims confronted truths long buried under polite society's insistence on denial. Descendants who had grown up on tales of honor, enterprise, and civility were forced to reconcile the fact that their forebears had inflicted unimaginable pain on human beings and had, in some cases, been buried alive by the very people they oppressed. Scholars later noted that the Fairfax case became a pivot point in Southern consciousness, indirectly influencing debates over access to education for enslaved and freed black people. Laws restricting access to medical texts, chemistry lessons, and even literacy were tightened, not only out of fear of rebellion, but as a preventative measure against the rise of another Solomon Fairfax. Yet the story also inspired underground currents of resistance. Clandestine networks of educated slaves and sympathetic abolitionists began covertly, sharing knowledge that could empower the oppressed, planting seeds of defiance that would ripple decades into the future. Among the elite, fear mingled with fascination. The city's social hierarchy, previously untouchable, now felt vulnerable, knowing that someone capable of precise, psychological vengeance could exist anywhere quiet, observant, waiting. Thomas Grimby, whose own documentation had preserved Fairfax's methods and motivations, became both a historian and moral arbiter, chronicling a narrative that blurred the line between heroism and horror. Newspapers cautiously published excerpts, balancing outrage with intrigue, while readers across the South wrestled with the realization that injustice, if ignored long enough, could incubate its own lethal correction. Fairfax's calculated terror left an indelible mark on Charleston's culture, law, and collective conscience, proving that knowledge, patience, and the human will could transcend oppression in ways society was neither prepared for nor capable of controlling. The dark truth had been exposed. Even the most tightly controlled world could be unraveled by one determined individual wielding intellect as a weapon. Solomon Fairfax's journal offers a window into a mind both methodical and haunted, a mind that transformed grief into strategy, anger into scientific precision. He wrote not as a madman, but as a philosopher of vengeance, dissecting human behavior with the same care he once reserved for his medical studies. Each entry details not only the logistics of his campaigns, the timing, the compounds, the surveillance, but also the emotions he cultivated within himself: patience, detachment, and an almost ritualistic sense of justice. He observed his victims long before he struck, learning their habits, their weaknesses, the casual cruelty that marked their lives. To him, this was not entertainment. It was documentation, a study in cause and effect. Fairfax's writing reveals a profound understanding of the psychological toll his actions would exact. He anticipated terror, not only in the immediate moment of paralysis, but in the prolonged awareness of impending death. His compounds were not designed to kill instantly, they were instruments of revelation, forcing the perpetrators of cruelty to experience, in concentrated hours, a fraction of the helplessness they had inflicted on enslaved families. Within these pages, Fairfax articulated a chilling moral logic. That justice delayed by systemic corruption could only be achieved through extraordinary measures. The journal also reflects the duality of his existence, the man he presented to the world versus the shadow he became in secret. By day, a compliant, educated slave, unassuming, almost invisible. By night, a meticulous executor of retribution, wielding intellect and chemical knowledge like a scalpel against those who had torn his family apart. He chronicled the emotional calculus of each killing, noting how each victim reacted in the moments of paralysis, their fear, their attempts to communicate, their growing comprehension of their own mortality. Fairfax's philosophy was unapologetically dark. He believed that true understanding required prolonged confrontation with consequence, and he cultivated a system in which his adversaries were forced to reckon with the human cost of their actions. And yet, beneath the anger and precision, there is a trace of sorrow, a reflection of a man who recognized that his revenge would never restore what he had lost. The journal is not only a record of crime, it is a study of pain, control, and the fragile veneer of civilization. It forces us, the readers, to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and the depths of human endurance. It asks whether an individual, denied the protection of law and society, might be compelled to become both judge and executioner. As we delve deeper into Fairfax's descent, the line between villain and victim begins to blur, revealing a truth too often hidden in history's shadows. Systems of oppression inevitably create their own reckoning. The evening of May 20th, 1853, arrived like a shadowed omen over Charleston, the streets glinting with the lamplight of a city blind to its own corruption. Captain Dandridge's mansion on East Bay Street, a monument to maritime wealth and human exploitation, gleamed as guests arrived, unaware that the very roof above them would become the stage for horror. Solomon Fairfax moved among the servants, a spectre of calm, blending into the clamor of preparation while his mind rehearsed every step of the evening. Martha, the elderly slave overseeing the kitchen, welcomed his assistants, oblivious to the lethal purpose behind his careful handling of ingredients. Each course became a calculated move in a deadly game, a chessboard where Dandridge and his wealthy peers were pawns. Fairfax's focus sharpened on the captain, the architect of his family's destruction, whose laughter and casual cruelty echoed through the dining room. The crystal chandeliers caught the candlelight like cold eyes, watching his every motion. Conversations among Charleston's shipping elite revealed the mechanisms of their world. Human lives quantified as cargo, profit margins calculated over tears, families disassembled like broken toys. Fairfax listened, catalogued, and waited. The final course, a brandy-soaked dessert, became the instrument of his vengeance. With practiced precision, he infused the captain's portion with the paralytic compound he had spent months perfecting. The toxin, masked by sweetness and alcohol, would immobilize yet preserve consciousness, forcing Dandridge to confront helplessly the consequences of his cruelty. As the dessert disappeared into the captain's mouth, Fairfax observed the initial signs: a faint flush, a slight stumble, dismissed as wine or heat. Minutes later, Dandridge excused himself, retreating to his private study, only to collapse into his chair, rigid and silent. The dinner room erupted in confusion when servants found him and physicians were summoned. They noted the unnatural muscle rigidity, the absence of common symptoms of stroke or heart failure, and murmured the word that would spread like wildfire: poisoned. Fairfax remained invisible, a calm shadow behind the chaos, knowing that the first act of his long-planned campaign had succeeded beyond mere speculation. News traveled swiftly through Charleston, and whispers of suspicion reached Thomas Grimby, the journalist who had been documenting recent unexplained deaths. For the first time, Fairfax was linked to a tangible scene, yet the veil of subtlety he had cultivated remained largely intact. As the city awoke to the horror of Dandridge's demise, Fairfax's mind turned to the next stage of his plan. 6 remaining targets awaited, men bound by greed and cruelty, whose ignorance of his presence would soon become their undoing. The calculated escalation of fear, the orchestration of controlled terror, and the demonstration of precision in administering justice revealed a man who had merged intellect with vengeance, science with morality in a way that society had never prepared to confront. This night was only the beginning of a descent into darkness that would expose Charleston's elite to the consequences of their own humanity or lack thereof. By June 1853, Solomon Fairfax's campaign had evolved from meticulous, targeted strikes into a plan of unprecedented audacity. The Henderson and Associates building, a hub of Charleston's most ruthless slave traders, had become the crucible for his final act. Fairfax had spent weeks observing the comings and goings of the 6 men he intended to confront, noting their schedules, habits, and the precise timing of their secretive evening meeting. Each detail was catalogued with the cold efficiency of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. His paralytic compound, now concentrated and refined, would not be administered individually this time. The scale demanded a more systemic approach. Utilizing his access to the office's gas lighting system, Fairfax devised a method to inject the toxin directly into the gas lines, ensuring that the air itself would become the instrument of judgment. On the night of June 15th, he positioned himself in the shadowed alley behind Henderson and Associates, watching as lamps flickered to life and cast an eerie glow over the building. Inside, the 6 men laughed, unaware that the very atmosphere that illuminated their greed was now a vessel of paralysis. Within minutes, bodies stiffened, voices froze mid-sentence, and panic set into eyes that could see but could no longer act. Fairfax waited, patient and detached, knowing that each second heightened the psychological terror that would define his legacy. Finally, using a duplicate key obtained through careful planning, he entered the building to witness the tableau of frozen wealth and terror. The 6 men sat rigid around the mahogany conference table, their eyes wide with helpless awareness, hearts pounding against immobile chests. He approached them individually, explaining in clinical, unflinching detail what was happening, how they would remain conscious while their control over their own bodies slipped entirely away. The sound of his voice mingled with their silent screams, a symphony of terror orchestrated to reflect the anguish his family had endured. It was a confrontation with mortality unlike any other, a lesson in helplessness delivered not through immediate death but prolonged awareness. Fairfax's intellect, once dedicated to healing, had transformed into a tool of calculated retribution, merging science with morality in a form society refused to recognize. As he prepared to leave, a shadow appeared at the corridor's edge. Thomas Grimby, persistent and driven, had arrived, drawn by the same trail of mystery and death that had followed Fairfax's steps for months. The encounter was electric, a collision of justice, vengeance, and the limits of moral comprehension. Grimby's presence would force Fairfax into a moment of revelation, one that would seal both their fates and redefine Charleston's understanding of fear, power, and the consequences of unbridled cruelty. The corridor was silent, thick with the oppressive weight of paralysis and dread, as Thomas Grimby stepped from the shadows into the gaslit hallway. His eyes widened at the scene that lay before him. 6 prominent men, frozen mid-action, their wide, panicked eyes tracking every movement, every sound, every calculated step of the man who had orchestrated this living nightmare. Solomon Fairfax turned slowly, acknowledging Grimby with the calm certainty that had defined every act of his methodical revenge. "So, it's true," Grimby said quietly, his voice a mixture of horror, fascination, and reluctant admiration. "Someone has been systematically destroying Charleston's elite, and it is you." Fairfax's gaze did not waver. "They destroyed my family. My children torn from me. My wife left to die. What you call murder, I call justice." The journalist, trained to uncover truth without bias, felt the conflict twist inside him. Here was a man who had executed 9 of the city's wealthiest and most powerful figures, yet the rationale, the meticulous preparation, the precision, all pointed to a mind shaped by years of injustice and oppression. "These men are still alive," Grimby said, noting the trembling eyes, the rigid limbs. "They are conscious. You've done this to them while keeping them aware. This is unimaginable." Fairfax nodded. "They will feel, for hours, the terror my family endured. They will contemplate the suffering they imposed on others. Justice denied becomes knowledge earned in ways law cannot provide." Time slowed. Each second was charged with moral complexity, ethical paradox, and the raw, undeniable power of vengeance in the hands of the oppressed. The distant sound of footsteps grew louder, voices approaching, sealing the inevitability of discovery. Grimby made a decision, one that would haunt him for decades. He would allow Fairfax to face the consequences, yet he would preserve the story, the method, the motive, for history to understand. "There's a back exit," Grimby whispered, almost pleading. "You could still escape. I could delay them, give you a head start." Fairfax, serene and resolute, shook his head. "No, my actions end here. My mission is complete, even if justice remains incomplete. Let them come. Let them see what they've created, and let the world remember that every system has limits." Within minutes, constables arrived, summoned by either routine vigilance or the inevitability of suspicion. They entered the room to find 6 men seated motionless, eyes wide with horror, and Fairfax standing calmly beside them. Confession ready, his voice steady, his presence commanding. His capture was swift, unresisted, yet the psychological and moral storm he had unleashed would ripple far beyond Charleston. Grimby's journalistic instincts merged with human empathy, recording every detail, every word, every confession, knowing that this story, buried beneath legality and silence, would one day emerge to confront a society built on oppression. As Fairfax was led away, the city itself seemed to shiver under the weight of truths long hidden, truths that would challenge morality, law, and the veneer of civilization in ways no one could ignore. Charleston's courthouse was a storm of whispers and tension the morning Fairfax's trial began. Men in powdered wigs and silk coats exchanged uneasy glances, while enslaved and free black spectators pressed into the back rows, drawn by morbid curiosity and a rare sense of vindication. Solomon Fairfax entered the courtroom with the same calm, unflinching demeanor he had maintained throughout his campaign of revenge. His eyes scanned the room, absorbing every detail, every expression of fear, outrage, and hidden admiration. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Rutledge, wasted no time portraying him as a cold-blooded murderer, a slave who had dared to overturn the natural order, killing 9 of Charleston's most prominent citizens in a calculated, deliberate act. Every word, every exhibit, every medical report was designed to shock the jury and the public. Yet the defense, under the reluctant guidance of Benjamin Crawford, turned the courtroom into a battlefield of morality rather than mere legality. Crawford did not deny Fairfax's actions. He framed them within the broader context of systemic cruelty. He painted a picture of families torn apart, of children sold like livestock, of women and men stripped of humanity by law and tradition. He presented Fairfax's journal, detailing the meticulous planning, the knowledge of poisons, the targeted selection of those who had profited from the destruction of his own family. Witnesses were called, some trembling, some composed, recounting not only Fairfax's actions, but the horrors of Charleston's slave system. From auction blocks to secret ledgers listing human lives alongside commodities. Grimby's notes, copied from his interviews and Fairfax's journal, became a silent but powerful presence in the courtroom, a record of every calculated detail. The jury, a collection of Charleston's elite, struggled with the paradox: undeniable guilt versus undeniable motive. Fairfax spoke with measured calm, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I was trained to preserve life, to heal. But when the system destroyed my family and sanctioned such destruction, I used the same knowledge to demand justice. I do not seek mercy. I seek acknowledgement of the system that made this necessary." Gasps filled the room. Murmurs spread like wildfire. No one had confronted the human consequences of slavery so directly, so viscerally. The trial was not just about 9 murders. It was an indictment of an entire social order. Jurors retired, and the decision seemed preordained. Yet the moral weight of Fairfax's defense lingered, haunting everyone present. When the verdict came, it was swift: guilty on all counts. Sentenced to death, Fairfax's capture and trial became a sensation across the South, not merely for the crimes, but for the uncomfortable truths they revealed about a society built on oppression, silence, and cruelty. October 15th, 1853, dawned heavy with tension over Charleston. Streets were lined with spectators, more than 2,000 strong, drawn by the notoriety of a man who had dared to overturn the social order through calculated vengeance. Solomon Fairfax was escorted to the gallows, his posture unyielding, his calm a stark contrast to the murmurs, gasps, and whispered prayers of the crowd. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the city sensed the weight of history being made in that moment. As the executioner prepared the rope, Fairfax spoke, his voice carrying over the assembled masses, cutting through the clamor with chilling clarity. "I die knowing that 9 men experienced the terror my children felt when they were sold away from everything they loved. That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. But this system that creates such desperation will continue, and other families will suffer as mine did. When that happens, remember that even the most patient man has limits to what he will endure in silence." His words were not just a declaration, they were a warning, a lesson carved into the conscience of every witness. Unlike ordinary criminals, Fairfax's execution was not just a punishment. It was a spectacle of moral reckoning. The crowd, some horrified, others silently admiring his resolve, struggled with the paradox of justice and vengeance. As the trapdoor released him, the sound echoed through the square, but in that moment, the true reverberations were psychological, seeping into the minds of every observer. Beyond the immediate horror, Fairfax's death catalyzed a ripple through Charleston and the wider South. Newspapers, letters, and journals carried the tale, sparking debates in parlors, churches, and courts about morality, slavery, and the consequences of dehumanization. Scholars would later note that the case challenged prevailing assumptions about enslaved people's intellect, agency, and capacity for strategic thought. Even after his execution, the shadow of Fairfax lingered, visible in heightened scrutiny of educated slaves, stricter controls over medical knowledge, and the paranoia of slaveholders. Yet there was another, quieter legacy. Thomas Grimby's meticulous documentation preserved not only Fairfax's actions, but the rationale behind them, ensuring that history could not entirely silence the uncomfortable truths of Charleston's elite. Grimby's memoirs, coupled with Fairfax's journal, revealed a society where calculated vengeance became a mirror reflecting systemic cruelty, and where knowledge itself, medical, chemical, and psychological, could be wielded as a weapon by those society deemed powerless. The execution, intended as closure, instead became a prism through which the moral contradictions of an entire era could be examined. The people of Charleston returned to their daily lives, but the weight of what they had witnessed, the meticulous revenge, the ethical paradoxes, the chilling composure of a man who had been wrong settled like a shadow over the city, impossible to shake. In the silent corners of the South, the story of Solomon Fairfax would echo for decades, a reminder that the oppressed can, and sometimes will, confront the powerful with the full force of their intellect, rage, and calculated strategy. Decades after Solomon Fairfax's death, Charleston slept under a fragile veil of normalcy, yet the city's soil had long held secrets that refused to remain buried. In 1923, during routine renovations at St. Michael's Cemetery, workers uncovered a startling anomaly. 9 coffins bore deep scratch marks etched into the interior wood, evidence of desperate attempts to claw their way back to life. The realization sent shockwaves through the local historical and medical communities. Each set of scratches aligned with the coffins of Fairfax's intended victims, confirming the horrifying accounts recorded in Thomas Grimby's memoirs and Fairfax's confiscated journal. These weren't just tales of methodical revenge, they were tangible proof that men, long celebrated for their wealth and influence, had suffered the ultimate psychological torment, fully conscious while trapped in their own graves. Authorities immediately sealed the records, citing public safety and fears of racial unrest. But whispers of the discovery spread faster than official statements could contain. Scholars and journalists debated the implications, recognizing that the scratch marks were not merely evidence of torture, they were testament to human endurance and the terrifying ingenuity of a man society sought to silence. Fairfax's journal, buried decades earlier beneath a magnolia tree by Grimby himself, became a symbol of forbidden knowledge preserved in defiance of censorship. Within its pages lay detailed accounts of chemical preparation, tactical planning, and a meticulous cataloging of each victim's participation in the slave trade. The combination of documentary evidence and physical proof created a chilling synthesis, a historical case where revenge, intellect, and moral outrage collided with lethal precision. The revelation forced Charleston, by extension the South, to confront uncomfortable truths long ignored. The intellectual capacities of enslaved people, the systemic brutality that made such vengeance conceivable, and the fragility of a social order built on the oppression of others. Public reaction was mixed. Some saw Fairfax as a monster, others as a darkly heroic figure challenging an immoral system. The scientific community, meanwhile, studied the paralytic compound he had synthesized, recognizing it as both a marvel of chemical understanding and a horrifying tool for control. Legal scholars revisited the trial, examining how the justice system had simultaneously punished and failed to understand the underlying causes of his actions. Across the region, plantation owners grew increasingly paranoid, tightening restrictions on education, medical training, and intellectual development for slaves, inadvertently confirming Fairfax's unspoken thesis: knowledge in the hands of the oppressed is power, and power can unsettle even the most entrenched hierarchies. The scratches in the coffins, simple yet profound, became more than historical artifacts. They were silent screams preserved in wood, a lasting reminder that history does not forget, that revenge can leave an indelible mark, and that human resilience, when combined with intellect and righteous fury, can challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. The reverberations of Solomon Fairfax's revenge extended far beyond Charleston, shaking the foundations of the antebellum South. Plantation owners and merchants, once confident in their unquestioned authority, now viewed every educated slave as a potential threat. Laws were swiftly enacted across multiple states, restricting access to literacy, scientific knowledge, and medical training for enslaved people. Fairfax's calculated use of chemistry, knowledge gained through observation and opportunity, revealed an uncomfortable truth. Intelligence among the oppressed could no longer be ignored or contained. It was not merely an act of revenge, it was a warning, a revelation of vulnerability in a society built on human subjugation. Historians later noted that the incident accelerated the codification of restrictions designed to prevent similar acts, creating a climate of paranoia that seeped into every corner of the South. But beyond legislation, Fairfax's story also ignited moral and philosophical debates that would echo for generations. Editors, intellectuals, and clergy questioned the legitimacy of condemning a man whose rage had been forged in the crucible of personal tragedy inflicted by the very society now punishing him. Was Fairfax a murderer, or was he a man reclaiming justice in a world where law offered none? Across the region, newspapers printed excerpts of Thomas Grimby's documentation, carefully balancing outrage with reluctant admiration for the precision of Fairfax's methods. Each retelling forced readers to confront the human cost of slavery, the families destroyed, the children torn from their mothers, the lives reduced to commodities in ledgers and auctions. Simultaneously, the medical community examined the paralytic compound, recognizing that it represented not only a potential tool for future crime, but also a harbinger of modern toxicology. Forensic techniques evolved, post-mortem examinations improved, and toxicology emerged as a discipline capable of detecting even subtle traces of chemical manipulation. Yet perhaps the most profound impact of Fairfax's actions lay in the collective consciousness of those who had once considered enslaved people incapable of complex thought, strategy, or moral reasoning. The myth of inherent subservience fractured, revealing that oppression could breed resistance as calculated and precise as the most elite criminal minds. In homes, plantations, and courtrooms, families whispered of the scratches in the coffins, the paralyzed men, the journal that survived hidden beneath the magnolia tree. Fairfax had not only killed, he had demonstrated that knowledge, when wielded by those denied justice, could penetrate the heart of power itself. This realization reshaped perceptions of authority, vulnerability, and the moral calculus of a society determined to maintain control over human lives. And for those who dared to study his story, it became a blueprint of intelligence, patience, and retribution. A case that blurred the line between evil and justice, leaving an unsettling question for every reader, historian, and viewer. In a world that denies justice, who truly holds the power to define it? Halfway through this story, Pause for a moment and comment below. Are you watching from? Type it twice. Let it echo. Let it ground you in the reality of these hidden truths. October 15th, 1853, arrived with an oppressive sense of inevitability. As Charleston's streets filled with over 2,000 spectators, drawn by the promise of witnessing the death of a man who had defied the very foundations of their society, SolomonFairfax.com and composed, walked toward the gallows with the same quiet certainty that had guided every act of his meticulously planned revenge. There was no struggle, no outburst, only the weight of history pressing down upon him. As the noose was secured, the crowd murmured, some with fear, some with morbid curiosity, and others with a thinly veiled sense of justice. Thomas Grimby stood at the edge of the throng, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the scene, knowing that every word recorded would shape the perception of Fairfax for generations. When Solomon's final words rang out, clear and unwavering, the crowd shivered with an uneasy mixture of awe and horror. I die knowing that 9 men experienced the terror my children felt when they were torn from everything they loved. That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. But the system that created this despair will continue. Remember that even the most patient man has limits to what he will endure in silence. The statement, neither plea nor confession, struck a nerve deeper than any physical act of violence. It revealed a truth most in Charleston were unwilling to confront. Injustice begets violence, and oppression carries consequences far beyond the immediate. Fairfax's body swung gently in the autumn breeze, yet the weight of his story was far heavier than the rope around his neck. Newspapers printed his words alongside Grimby's accounts, igniting debates in homes and courtrooms from Virginia to Louisiana, challenging citizens to confront their complicity in a system that commodified human lives. In private, plantation owners and merchants shivered, fearful that the next Solomon Fairfax might be closer than they believed. The trial, the execution, the journal, and the post-mortem revelations of paralyzed victims alive within their coffins became a legend whispered in the shadows, a story that refused to remain buried. Forensic medicine gained new respect. Legal scholars debated moral responsibility versus criminal culpability, and historians traced the cracks in Charleston's social structure that Fairfax had exposed. And yet, the most haunting legacy was intangible, the reminder that knowledge, intelligence, and moral awareness could transform even the most oppressed into agents of calculated justice, capable of shaking the world of the powerful to its core. To truly understand Solomon Fairfax is to look beyond the surface of crime and punishment, and stare directly at the human cost of systems that justify oppression. He was a healer and a destroyer, a man molded by suffering, and his story forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths that society often tries to hide. Pause here, viewer. Let it sink. Let it echo in your mind. Comment below. Are you watching from? Type it twice. Let it anchor you in this shadowed reality, and recognize the power of history that refuses to lie dormant. Decades passed, yet the story of Solomon Fairfax did not fade. It lingered like a shadow over Charleston, a dark testament to the consequences of unchecked cruelty. In 1923, during routine renovations at St. Michael's Cemetery, workers discovered something that would reignite the city's buried past: 9 coffins. Once thought to contain peacefully interred men of Charleston's elite, bore deep scratches along the inner wood, evidence that the occupants had clawed desperately at their own graves. The revelation confirmed every chilling detail Thomas Grimby had recorded in his memoirs decades earlier, and validated the terror that Fairfax had inflicted as both punishment and statement. Officials moved quickly to seal the records, citing public safety and the risk of inflaming racial tensions. But the truth had already seeped into the collective consciousness of Charleston. The journal, carefully buried beneath a magnolia tree by Grimby himself, became a symbol, a warning, and a confession preserved outside the reach of legal or societal control. Scholars and journalists who stumbled upon fragments of its contents marveled at the precision, the cold intellect, and the relentless logic Fairfax had applied in his campaign. Every step had been calculated: the acquisition of chemical knowledge, the strategic observation of his targets, the psychological torment of keeping victims conscious while paralyzed, and the final confession that forced the city to confront a moral abyss it had long ignored. Fairfax's legacy extended far beyond Charleston's boundaries. Laws restricting the education of enslaved people were tightened. Southern slaveholders feared the latent power of knowledge in the hands of the oppressed. Medical examiners and toxicologists studied his methods, advancing forensic science in ways unintended but irrevocable, understanding that even the most exotic poisons could be detected with rigorous inquiry. And yet, the story retained a human, visceral core: the suffering of a family destroyed, the deliberate terror inflicted upon men who had thrived on cruelty, and the chilling reflection that one individual, armed with intellect and a deep understanding of justice, could dismantle the illusion of invulnerability surrounding the powerful. Today, Solomon Fairfax's name is rarely spoken aloud, but his story endures in whispers, journals, and the scratches in those 9 coffins, an eternal reminder that oppression contains within it the seeds of violent reckoning. He was more than a criminal. He was an indictment of a system that commodified human life. His revenge was methodical, horrifying, and morally complex, mirror held up to a society that refused to see its own brutality. Pause once more, viewer. Let the darkness of this history settle in. Reflect on the power of knowledge, the weight of injustice, and the limits of human endurance. Comment now: where are you watching from? Type it twice. Engage with the truth buried beneath centuries, and carry it with the awareness that history's shadows are never truly gone. If this journey into forbidden history gripped you, hit like, share with someone who understands the depths of human secrecy, and subscribe to uncover more stories hidden in plain sight, waiting for those brave enough to seek them.